In 2024, Tesla lost 14% of its market share in Norway, one of the world's most advanced electric vehicle markets. At the same time, the European Union warned it would respond strongly to America's new tax policies, while Canada, in a surprising shift, began sourcing military equipment from Europe rather than the United States. What exactly is happening between these three power centers, the US, Europe, and Canada? During a recent meeting with NATO's Secretary General, President Donald Trump harshly criticized the EU's trade policies, stating, "We have a problem with the EU, they won't import our agricultural products or our cars, while we import millions of BMWs, Mercedes-Benz, and Volkswagens." Trade between the US and the EU exceeds $1.2 trillion annually. While the US market remains largely open to European imports, the EU maintains barriers against US agriculture and automobiles. Trump has also targeted the EU's favorable tax arrangements with companies like Apple, calling it a financial battle. In response, he threatened additional tariffs, which only deepened tensions with major EU economies like Germany and France. Tesla, once a symbol of American innovation, is now facing unprecedented criticism in Europe. In Denmark, the academic pension fund sold all its Tesla shares due to the company's refusal to sign union labor agreements, poor governance, and Elon Musk's controversial political views. Pension Denmark withdrew 400 million kroner after Tesla's labor agreement rejection in Sweden sparked widespread strikes. Service centers, transport hubs, and inspection points stopped handling Tesla vehicles, severely disrupting its operations. Elon Musk's political remarks have significantly damaged Tesla's reputation in Europe. His support for far-right parties such as Germany's AfD, the UK's Reform Party, and controversial figures in Italy and Romania has drawn sharp criticism. As a result, Tesla's market share in Norway plummeted from 21.7% to just 7.4% within a year. Public opinion also took a hit. Positive views of Tesla fell from 19% to 11%, while negative opinions rose from 47% to 63%. In the UK, 59% of EV consumers refused to buy a Tesla because of Musk's polarizing statements. European regulators have increased scrutiny of Tesla, citing concerns about consumer safety and data protection. At the same time, Tesla is losing ground to competitors like Volkswagen, Toyota, and China's BYD, which have launched competitively priced models. Tesla has also been criticized for delays in releasing affordable EV models, losing its edge to local brands that benefit from favorable policies and stronger consumer loyalty. Meanwhile, Canada is quietly forming a new economic and defense alliance with Europe. Foreign Minister Melanie Joly confirmed that Canada is finalizing talks to purchase European military equipment, including Sweden's Saab Gripen jets, in a bid to reduce reliance on U.S. defense supplies amid ongoing trade policy uncertainties. The EU-Canada Free Trade Agreement, CETA, has increased bilateral trade by 60% since 2017. With 75% of Canadian exports currently going to the U.S., Canada is now seeking to diversify and lessen its dependency on American markets. Enhanced collaborations between Canada and the EU now extend into sectors such as research, technology, and sustainable energy, marking a significant pivot from traditional U.S. partnerships. In response to new U.S. tariffs, EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen warned, "If the EU is targeted by unfair trade practices, we will respond strongly." Europe is considering retaliatory tariffs on products from pro-Washington U.S. states, aiming to defend fair trade and show that it will not tolerate protectionist moves. European leaders have signaled a readiness to strengthen economic cooperation with allies like Canada, Japan, and South Korea to counterbalance U.S. policies. Are these shifts signaling the beginning of a major realignment in the global economic order, one that increasingly sidelines the U.S. as Europe and Canada forge new alliances? As Americans face higher prices for Japanese cars, Japan appears to be preparing a financial retaliation that could shake the U.S. economy. The U.S.-Japan auto trade war is escalating, with the U.S. continuously raising tariffs on automobile parts from Japan, particularly in the electric vehicle sector. A 25% tariff on Japanese auto parts has driven up the cost of Toyota, Honda, and Nissan vehicles in the U.S., eroding their competitive edge. According to the Japan Automobile Manufacturers Association, Japanese car sales in the U.S. dropped by 7% in the first quarter of 2025. Meanwhile, American automakers like Ford and General Motors are gaining market share due to U.S. government protectionist policies. These price hikes reduce consumer purchasing power and hurt Japanese automakers, whose profits are shrinking as production costs rise. But Japan isn't just responding with rhetoric, it's taking financial action. As the second largest holder of U.S. Treasury bonds, over $1.1 trillion, Japan sold $30 billion worth of these bonds in February 2025. This move weakened the U.S. dollar and increased interest rates, creating financial pressure on the U.S. economy. It's a high-risk but calculated strategy, leveraging Japan's financial influence to retaliate. Japan is also shifting production away from the U.S. Manufacturing is being moved to Mexico and Southeast Asia to minimize tariff impacts while still accessing the U.S. market. Automakers like Toyota and Honda are investing heavily in these regions, where labor is cheaper and U.S. protectionist policies don't apply. This strategic move not only affects the U.S. economy, but also raises investor caution about buying U.S. bonds as Japan reduces its stake. If tensions continue to escalate, Japan may take even stronger retaliatory steps. One such measure could be restricting the export of core technologies, especially solid-state batteries, an area where Japanese companies lead. If the U.S. imposes more tariffs on Japanese EV technology, Japan might halt battery exports, significantly slowing down U.S. EV development efforts. Additionally, Japan could increase tariffs on U.S. goods such as electronics, machinery, and food products. While continuing trade with the U.S., Japan is also deepening its cooperation with the European Union. Trade agreements between Japan and the EU are helping to diversify markets and protect Japan's automotive industry from U.S. tariff threats. With expanding electric vehicle production in Europe, Japan ensures it remains competitive while reducing reliance on the U.S. Will Japan's economic retaliation force the U.S. to revise its tax policies? Or will the U.S. maintain its hard stance, triggering wider financial consequences? Stay tuned to find out. Meanwhile, President Trump is threatening to impose a 200% tariff on European wines, cognac, and other alcoholic imports. He posted, "The European Union has just put a nasty 50% tariff on whiskey. If this tariff is not removed immediately, the U.S. will shortly place a 200% tariff on all wines, champagnes, and alcoholic products." This bold threat is part of a broader strategy to pressure the EU into changing what the US sees as unfair tax policies. In 2023, the EU exported $13.1 billion worth of alcoholic beverages to the US, French wine being the flagship product. A 200% tariff could cause prices to soar, severely shrinking EU wine's market share in the US and threatening the European wine industry. The EU has responded strongly, asserting that it won't abandon its wine industry and is prepared to defend its economic interests. France, Italy, and Spain, all major wine producers, stand to lose billions in revenue if American consumers are priced out. This trade standoff might benefit US winemakers, who could expand their presence both at home and in the EU, especially if retaliatory measures shift consumer preferences. As this transatlantic wine war heats up, the question remains: will the EU back down, or will the US seize the opportunity to take over market share in Europe? Finally, we turn to Canada. The US imports over 4.3 million barrels of oil per day from its northern neighbor, accounting for 60% of total US oil imports. If Canada follows through on its threat to cut exports, gas prices in the U.S. could skyrocket, refineries could shut down, and a full-blown energy crisis could erupt. For decades, the U.S. and Canada have enjoyed a stable energy relationship. Over 90% of Canadian oil exports go to the U.S. via pipelines and shipping routes. U.S. refineries, particularly in the Midwest, are designed to process Canadian heavy crude, not lighter oils from other countries. This setup has worked well for both nations. Canada gains a steady market, and the U.S. secures a reliable supply without relying on volatile regions like the Middle East. But now, tensions are rising. Canadian officials have hinted that if Washington doesn't change its trade policies, oil exports could be slashed. While similar tactics have been used by countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia, the U.S.-Canada interdependence makes this threat uniquely dangerous. Over half of U.S. oil imports come from Canada, and refineries aren't easily adaptable to alternative sources. The switch would be costly and time-consuming. If Canada cuts supply, the consequences would be immediate and severe: spiking gas prices, economic disruptions, and potential supply chain chaos. The two nations are now walking a fine line between cooperation and conflict. What happens next could define the future of energy security in North America. Trump's 50% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum is meant to protect American industries, but the truth is, it's already backfiring. A report from the U.S. National Economic Council reveals that domestic production costs have risen by 10 to 15%, making American businesses less competitive globally. U.S. automakers, machinery manufacturers, and construction companies that rely heavily on Canadian metals are now facing a supply chain crisis. The American construction industry warns that material costs could spike by 20%, leading to higher housing prices and stalled infrastructure projects. Trump's move may have aimed to protect jobs, but instead, it might have just created a new set of economic problems. Canada is not staying silent. Ontario Premier Doug Ford has threatened to cut electricity exports to the U.S., which could drive up energy prices by 15 to 20% in states like New York, Vermont, and Minnesota. Ford announced a 25% surcharge on electricity exports for the 1.5 million American homes and businesses Ontario powers. In addition, Canada is considering cancelling its contract with Elon Musk's Starlink, a major setback for the billionaire's satellite internet project. If terminated, millions of rural users in both the US and Canada could lose access to high-speed internet. Canada is making it clear, they're not backing down. This trade war is hitting more than just government spreadsheets. Canadian travel to the US has dropped by over 40%, costing the American tourism industry billions. States like Florida, California, and Nevada are losing revenue as fewer Canadian tourists visit. Canadian businesses are also cutting imports from the US, shifting to European and Japanese suppliers instead. Major American brands like McDonald's, Coca-Cola, and Walmart are reporting Canadian sales drops of 8 to 12%. The fallout is real, and American companies are starting to bleed. As US-Canada relations crumble, China is seizing the opportunity. Canadian oil exports to China have surged by 25%, and the trend is growing. Beijing is now buying Canadian wheat, beef, and lumber, exports that once flowed south to the US. If this continues, China could become Canada's top trading partner within 5 years. Trump's tariffs may have just handed Canada over to China on a silver platter. The long-term economic impact could be even more devastating. A University of Toronto study predicts Canada's GDP could shrink by 0.5%, but the US might lose up to 1% due to rising costs and supply chain disruptions. Investors are already reacting. The S&P 500 dropped 3% after Trump's announcement, while Canada's TSX index held firm, thanks to its pivot toward Asia. If this trade war continues, both sides will suffer, but the U.S. could take the bigger hit. Trump's policies are pushing America's allies to become rivals. After raising tariffs by 25% on imported aluminum and steel, Trump triggered immediate retaliation from the EU, Canada, and Mexico. The EU imposed tariffs on U.S. goods including cars, whiskey, and agricultural products, which led to a $15 billion loss for American exporters in the first year. Inflation has surged as consumers pay more for imported goods, with prices rising by 12% over 2 years. Thousands of manufacturing jobs have been lost in Midwestern states like Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin. Trump's approval ratings in agricultural states have dropped by 9% as farmers struggle under retaliatory tariffs. Meanwhile, Trump is dismantling the education system. Over 50% of the Department of Education staff was fired in a staged emergency evacuation that locked him out permanently. Programs supporting students with disabilities were cut by 40%, affecting 6 million children. School lunch assistance lost 30% of its funding, and public schools in states like Texas, Florida, and Ohio now face severe budget shortages. Dropout rates among students with disabilities have increased by 18% in just 6 months. Former officials say this isn't just cost-cutting, it's a deliberate attack on equal access to education. Healthcare and social support systems are also under attack. Trump cut $880 billion from Medicaid, which serves over 80 million low-income Americans. The Department of Veterans Affairs laid off 70,000 employees, despite 19 million veterans needing care. The Social Security Administration lost 7,000 workers, leading to massive delays in processing benefits. Over 4 million Americans lost health insurance in 1 year. VA hospitals in major states like New York, California, and Texas are overwhelmed, with wait times doubling. People with disabilities now wait 12 months for benefits, twice as long as before. Veterans say they feel abandoned. Trump isn't protecting the vulnerable, he's making them fight for the basic services they earned. Americans are beginning to realize the truth. A new poll shows that 45% of former Trump voters now feel betrayed. Protests are erupting across the country, especially in cities like Washington, New York, and Chicago. People are demanding an end to social welfare cuts and calling out what Democratic lawmakers have called the greatest political scam in U.S. history. Trump claims to stand with the working class, but his policies continue to favor billionaires. Even after Trump walked back tariffs on most products from Mexico and Canada, Canada kept its retaliatory measures in place. The Canadian government announced a $760 billion response, refusing to back down. From small shops to major retailers, Canadians are boycotting U.S. goods, turning to local alternatives and European brands. Online demand for Canadian products is surging, and the country is rapidly rebuilding trade ties with Asia and Europe. The Canada-EU trade agreement is already paying off. Trade between Canada and the EU has increased by 7% since the agreement took effect, as Canadian businesses reduce dependence on the U.S. Meanwhile, Canada's energy exports are now being used as a strategic tool. In 2023, over 50% of U.S. imported oil came from Canada, but that's changing. Japan and South Korea are now importing Canadian oil and gas, reducing reliance on the Middle East. Canada's newly expanded Trans Mountain pipeline is boosting exports to Asia at a higher value than what the U.S. market offers. If this continues, the U.S. could face serious energy insecurity in the future. Canada has not only retaliated but transformed. The tariff war triggered a surge of nationalism, with Canadians uniting across political lines to defend their sovereignty. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's approval rating is rising as Canadians rally around a common cause. Canada is no longer just reacting, it's reshaping its future. By diversifying trade, building new alliances, and using energy as leverage, Canada is becoming more independent than ever. the US-Canada relationship may never return to what it once was. This shift will have lasting consequences not only for both economies but for America's position on the global stage. Canada has shown that it can stand on its own, and the world is watching.